for elementary, secondary, and specialized education. And it's a pleasure to be spending the next hour with you to talk a bit about our recent focus group for English learners, which is part of our larger effort around preparing for the transition to the new Every Student Succeeds Act, which will be fully implemented and beginning in school year 2017-18. So we're going to spend the next hour walking through a lot of content. I'm going to move relatively quickly so that we can also make sure that we have time to build in some pauses so that you can share thoughts with us. But please do know that this is an ongoing dialogue. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk to you about additional ways in which you can give us feedback. So if you have thoughts after the overview, please reach out to us and share them as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm accompanied today by two of our resident experts in the work. I have Dr. Lanisha Adams, who is with us from the Division of Assessment and Research. And I also have Anika Harris, who is one of our professional development experts supporting English language learners on the ESEA team. So we are in good hands. If I don't know something, they will. Okay. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Such as how to turn the slides. All right, great. So here's just a brief overview of what we have planned for the hour. Essentially, we're following the format that we used for the focus group itself, which is to start out by giving you an overview both of what's happening with ESSA and in DC, how we're approaching the work. And then we're going to be moving through core content areas and giving you a sense of the initial themes that came out of the conversation last week, and then pause to give you a chance to also weigh in and add your reflections or thoughts. If you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, you can also go ahead and type those into the question chat box, and our team will be responding throughout, so we'll have multiple ways of having a conversation. Okay, so first, just a very brief overview of ESSA and kind of where we are in DC and the connections to the work. We know in DC that we have some real bright spots. Over the past few years, we've seen that we're making tremendous progress in terms of our public education system. We know that from two key points here, where you see, first of all, that overall enrollment has been increasing, and that's been a steady increase, so families are voting to stay in the public system, and that's really a sign of confidence in the work that's been done. And then second, we know that through the assessment results on the NAEP, which is really our national benchmark around both reading and math, we see these increases, and these are the fourth grade results in particular. But you'll see that we are, while we still have a lot of work to do to catch up to the national average, we've been really accelerating progress over the past few years. And as I just noted, we also at the same time know we have a long way to go. So what you see in front of you on this slide is our most recent PARCC results. And again, looking at the data, you can see that we're making progress. We, as you know, in DC have identified on the 5-level scale that levels 4 and 5 are what we consider to be signs that students are college and career ready. And so if you look at the results here, again, we've seen some increases, which is great, but we also see that from 2015 to 2016, we're still in a situation where the majority of our students are not college and career ready based on the PARCC assessment results. These two next slides dig a little bit more deeply. Again, most of you, I'm sure, have really dug in even more deeply as practitioners to these results. So these are not surprising, but you'll see here that, again, we've seen growth, which is exciting, but the amount of growth has been 1 to 4%. And if you look now, starting to think about English learners and our work ahead, you can see here that with the ELA results for 2016, English language learners scored at 14%, levels 4 and 5. So again, we're still that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of preparing our students. And then same for math results, a little bit higher, but you see that English learners, the percentage of students at 4 or 5 is 19%. So as we think about the work ahead, something that we've really focused on within osse is to think about what is most important in our work. And what should our North Star goals be for not just the agency, but for the city as we're all working toward improving outcomes together. So the superintendent mapped out these two priorities, one to become the fastest improving state and city in the nation, and then the second to ensure greater equity and outcomes for students, particularly by accelerating progress for those students who are when we think about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the intent of the Act is really anchored in those same priorities. It's a federal funding law that is anchored in a civil rights framework, and its focus is to ensure that all children, regardless of initial advantage, have a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain a high-quality education. So we now are going to talk a little bit about ESSA, which is, of course, the reauthorization of ESEA, and start thinking about it in the context of English learners. So first, this is just a very high-level data snapshot. Again, many of you may be aware that we actually have a significant population of English learners in DC, and we also know that it is one of the fastest growing populations. And so you see here that we have about 9% of our students are English learners of our total population, which again is significant for such a small jurisdiction. It's a very diverse jurisdiction. So now we're going to jump into thinking about the key provisions of ESSA. I'm going to go ahead and pull these all up. And again, in the framework of equity, access, and accelerating outcomes, what makes sense to think about as we develop our state plan under ESSA? So first, just giving you a high-level overview of what ESSA speaks to. ESSA shifts a lot of key requirements for English learners out of Title III and into Title I. And this is significant because it makes sure, this move makes sure that English learners are considered and included in all of the core requirements of ESEA in a way they hadn't been before. So it's definitely a significant shift, and it really makes sure that the focus on English learners is steady and is increased across the city, which is important. There are some provisions that are in place that actually in DC we are already implementing. So the first is that states must adopt English language proficiency standards and administer an annual assessment of English language proficiency. And then a second is that English learners must be included in academic content assessments and provided appropriate accommodations. So those two pieces of the law are in place in DC. One of the pieces that is a bit new and something that we consider in the focus group and want to consider today is that under ESSA, states do have additional flexibility around the inclusion of newcomers in the assessment during their first year of enrollment. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So some additional key provisions. Another piece is, which is important for us to consider, is in relation to the new accountability system, which we are required to develop under ESEA. And so now state accountability systems must include English language proficiency as a performance indicator for all Title I schools. And we also must set long-term goals and interim measures of progress toward proficiency. In addition, we have to implement state-designed accountability measures for this subgroup. And again, that's true of other subgroups, but we're speaking specifically to English learners today. And then there's a new emphasis in ESSA, which is related to ensuring that supports for schools that don't meet their targets are evidence-based. So there's an emphasis on making sure that there's a sound evidence base for interventions. Additionally, under Title III, we know that we have been working on implementing entrance and exit criteria in DC. It looks a little bit different based on the LEA. And so now we have a new requirement for states to standardize entrance and exit criteria and procedures. We have the additional assurance that ELs will be identified within 30 days of enrollment. So we're going to dig in a little bit to that piece as well in terms of what that standardization should look like. All right, so actually let me pause for a moment and see if there are any questions or reflections you have before we start digging more deeply into the three key considerations we presented. Okay, great. So we're going to keep going here. Oops. There we go. Just to give you a sense of the focus group last week, we had 25 stakeholders from various LEAs, which we were excited about, so a lot of practitioners in the field. We also had some advocacy groups, support groups, and interest groups with a local focus and a national focus, which was also great to have their perspectives. And then we divided into three groups where we did a bit more of a deep dive, and for each of those we focused on some key requirements. The first was looking at standards and assessments, some of the decision points we need to make as an ESEA and as a city. The second was related to entry and exit procedures and criteria. And then the third was related to ELP accountability. So we're going to look at those now. Before we turn there, actually, we did include another summary slide, which you see here. And this was, we posed a question to some questions to the group, as you can see here, to kind of think big picture, what would success look like as we're working toward creating this new plan for English learners in DC. And then also what people felt were the greatest levers for change. So I'll give you a chance to just take a look at people's comments there. Okay. So now looking at these key considerations, the first was related to standards and assessments. And you see in the top of this slide, again, an overview of what the requirement is in terms of adopting ELP standards and administering an annual assessment. As I said earlier, we know that we're already doing this work. And there's, for each of these, you'll see a summary of our current status. In DC, we currently use the WIDA English Language Development Standards. And then we have adopted and we use the WIDA Access for ELLs as our assessment. So critical questions we posed to the group were, as you can see, should DC continue the use of current WIDA standards and the access for ELLs for accountability purposes? And then second, should osse exclude first, and that's really DC, exclude first-year newcomers from the PARCC English language assessment? So I'm going to show you what we heard in terms of feedback here. So we had some major themes around the WIDA standards. Some folks said that the standards are hard to understand if people are not properly trained, and don't really give a nuanced understanding of what students can do at different levels. And I think a few people said that the standards are more useful at the elementary level. Is that right, Anika? Anika was in this group, so that was interesting to hear. There's a lot of interest in more training around the standards and essentially how to use them, both for administrators and teachers. In terms of assessments, kind of some similar feedback. That WIDA provides limited information on what students can do, and teachers need more support in understanding how to use the scores and to link the scores with academic content expectations. And then again, the secondary educators want an assessment that gives more insight and and more information. So in considering these two questions, the group's recommendation was that we should maintain the current WIDA standards and the current assessment as we move forward. And at the same time, there's a real push for more training and support on how to utilize the WIDA tools. So I'll pause here and again give folks a chance to weigh in if they would like. Okay, we're going to keep going. We haven't seen anything come in. You can always send a note at any time. Okay, so then this next piece of the discussion was related to assessment of newcomers. And so, as I noted earlier, ESEA allows for states to make some choices around this issue in terms of including ELs who have been recently enrolled in the assessment. So there are two options that are in the law, and then there's a third, which we'll look at, which is in proposed regulations. So option one, you see here, is that states may exclude recently arrived English learners from one administration of the PARCC ELA assessment. Even with that exclusion, newcomer ELs must still take math and ELP tests, but those results will not be included in the accountability framework for their first year. And then during the second year, they must be included in both assessments, and their results are included in the accountability results. So that's option one. Option two is kind of a layered approach to inclusion, or graduated approach. So in option two, states may test and report on the performance in math and PARCC ELA for each year of enrollment in a school. But in the first year, they may exclude recently arrived EL's math and ELA test results from the accountability determinations. In the second year, they must include a measure of academic growth in those determinations. And then in the third year, they must include the proficiency levels of those students who were assessed. So you see that it's a slightly different approach to inclusion in the results. And then this last approach, which is a little bit of a hybrid that is in the proposed regulations right now, would possibly allow a combination of options 1 and 2. And in this approach, there would be a statewide uniform procedure used to decide which students would use option 1 or 2 based on grade, ELP level, time in EL instruction, native language procedure, and time in formal education. So it's a lot to chew on. So we looked at this question, and you see here where folks landed. We asked which of the proposed options would fit best for DC. So in terms of looking at option 1, folks felt that the ELA results are likely unreliable for newcomer students who are at low ELP levels, and that including them may be frustrating. Including those students may be frustrating for students at low levels in particular. And then there was another thought that including proficiency levels in PARCC ELA tests in the second year might be too soon for those students. In terms of looking at option 2, which kind of sets a baseline and then looks at growth and then ultimately proficiency over that 3-year period, people liked that that option allowed for baseline data. They noted that while it's frustrating for students to take math and in some cases science in their first year, adding language arts would allow us to measure student growth in year 2 and beyond. And then some folks said that because the EL subgroup is transient, it might make it difficult to implement such a growth model as contemplated. So ultimately, the group recommended a differentiated hybrid approach of both options, which would exclude newcomers from the ELA assessment at ELP levels 1 and 2, but include newcomers at levels 3 and above. So again, that's a lot to think about. I'm going to pause before we move to the next section. We're not seeing any comments. Just checking here to see if we have questions or comments coming in. Okay, so we got a couple of questions about the slides being available. We can certainly email them out. We'd be happy to do that. They are also posted on, well, they will be posted on our ESEA webpage, and the slides from the initial focus group are already posted. So you'll see the framing of all of the considerations that's already in that slide deck, but we'll send these out as well. Okay, so now we're going to move to the next consideration, which is looking at entry and exit criteria and procedures. So as I noted earlier, we currently do have exit and entry criteria in place in the district, but there's also flexibility and a bit of autonomy in terms of how LEAs implement the procedures in particular. So this, the big shift here is that we need to set standardized statewide criteria and procedures. So you'll see here again, we mapped out the current status in place for identifying and exiting ELs in terms of the procedures that we've laid out. There are 3 mapped out here for you, which you are likely familiar with. But they touch on use of the home language survey upon enrollment, the use of a state-approved pre-screener for determining EL status, and then finally exit criteria as determined through the use of access for ELs as the primary exit criteria, the composite score of 5. or above. So the questions we pose to the group are current entry and exit procedures sufficient? Are they clear? Are they in use across all LEAs? And then second, should we include additional exit criteria? What could those be? So again, we got some really rich feedback. First, starting with this question about our current procedures. The group said that not all LEAs are clear on entry procedures, that the current OSSE home language survey is not robust, that they are worried that some folks are getting identified who shouldn't be and some who should be aren't. The group supported the idea of procedures being standardized and also felt they needed to be changed. There was a specific request for more and better screeners in pre-K settings. And then again, that distinction of elementary and secondary students and making sure we're differentiating our approach came up through this context. So recommendations, we just touched on the home language survey. And then there was a second piece that came up about making sure that parents are aware, in terms of procedures, that parents are aware that we are, that their children have been identified for pre-screening and making sure that there's a notification process that's standardized for parents regarding this next step we're taking. So for exit criteria, the group felt that additional criteria are necessary, and students should only be exited at Tier C, not at A or B. Also, a question about long-term ELs. There's the students who are staying in EL status for many years and not exiting, whether they're actually benefiting from EL services. And one thing that we didn't capture on the slide, but that also came up in all three groups was the challenge of students who are identified as students with disabilities and English learners, and the need for more support around supporting those students well and making sure that they're appropriately identified in both buckets. The recommendation here was considering an eligibility process to determine when a child is ready to exit, and using multiple criteria and data sources. So not just the access composite score, but additional sources. Okay, so I'm going to, before we jump into the easy topic of accountability, I'm going to pause again and see if anyone has any thoughts or questions for us. Okay. All right. So we did receive one question, which we responded to, and we're about to dive into here, around accountability and the inclusion of ELs in the accountability system. So, as we noted, ESSA requires the inclusion of English language proficiency as a performance indicator within all state accountability systems. And then this actually speaks to the question, so that each state must establish ambitious long-term goals and interim measures of progress, and states have the option to include exited ELs in the EL subgroup for achievement for up to 4 years. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So again, current status, I'm sure many of you know that this is the case, that under NCLB only LEAs receiving Title III Part A funding were held accountable for EL performance. And they were held accountable through what was called Annual Measurable Achievement Objectives, or AMAOs. And so this is just an overview of, again, what has been in place. So there is a student level growth measure, which was 0.6 on the access, 0.6 improvement year to year on the access assessment. And then there was an LEA level of looking at proficiency. And so you see here that this is mapped out. This is what was in our waiver in terms of the proficiency targets at the student level and at the LEA level. So the critical questions are mapped out here in terms of what this new accountability framework should look like. And so I'll walk through them briefly. One is related to long-term goals and timeline. What's an appropriate timeline toward proficiency? The second is related to measurements of interim progress. So what should those growth goals look like? As I mentioned, this is similar to AMAO 1, the growth measure under NCLB. So the question is, what's appropriate based on our knowledge of this population and the different strengths and challenges that they have? What makes sense as a rigorous but reasonable goal? The next question is a critical question was how long should we include, or should we include at all, former ELs in the EL subgroup for accountability purposes? And as I noted just now, ESEA allows for states to include former ELs in the results of the subgroup for accountability for up to 4 years. And then last, how much weight should be given to the ELP indicator within the full accountability system? Keeping in mind that the weight will be consistent across all subgroups. So if you think of the other subgroups, such as students with disabilities, economically disadvantaged, we have to think about what is the right weighting for those subgroups in the system. Okay, so I'm going to walk through some of the feedback we got, and then again pause. Make sure you have a chance to weigh in and share any questions or thoughts. So feedback we got from the group. In terms of long-term goals and timeline, the recommendation from the group was that we consider 5 years for a proficiency timeline. And here's the note regarding the consideration of ELs who may also have disabilities. There was a request to kind of think about, should there be variability or differentiation in terms of how we measure, how much time we give and how we measure proficiency. Measurements of interim progress. There was a real interest from the group in considering growth and making sure that growth is a significant feature of our accountability framework. And we've actually heard that in multiple settings across the city as we've been discussing the accountability framework in general. And then we got some feedback on the question of including former ELs in the EL subgroup. Some felt 4 years might be too long and may artificially inflate scores, which might mask the real work that needs to be done for ELs who are still in the receiving services. And then I think there was a discussion around that. We've done a little bit of analysis of that and seen that the inflation may not be as significant. Of course, it depends on how the system is designed. There was a request for data transparency. So if we are including former ELs in the EL subgroup, folks wanted to see how many and kind of see what the picture looked like in terms of who were currently receiving services and who were former ELs. And then a discussion of N size and thinking about the impact of the minimum N size on the system. And there was no strong consensus, which mirrors kind of some discussions nationally on this option. And the group felt that regardless of where we land, the disaggregation of former ELs and current ELs would be important for us to understand what the needs were. Yes, I have a request to go back to slide 27. We have a lot of animations here. So okay. So someone asked to just get a chance to take another look at this. Okay, keep going. Okay, we are following up through our chat box with that with the individual who made that request, so we can circle back. Okay, so I think we're on the last consideration for the accountability group, which was looking at the indicator and weight. How much weight should be given to the ELP indicator? Again, you see some themes here. Concern about WIDA being given too much weight, essentially, and this connects back to some of what the other groups were speaking to, that having this one summative score may not be appropriate. A concern was raised about the weight being high, discouraging schools from supporting ELs. And you see some of the other comments. It was a really thoughtful group around this issue. So, and you see here again that emphasis of on growth. And so overall, the group recommended that the indicator have a low weight, and they suggested that it be at or less than 10%. So that ends our review of the discussion and the critical questions. Again, I'll give you a chance to gather your thoughts, and feel free to type anything in that you'd like us to think about. Our next steps on the work overall are that we are continuing to hold external focus groups. In fact, tomorrow we have a focus group on the other special populations addressed by ESEA. It's at the Sumner School from 9:30 to 11:30, and as with this focus group, we'll be holding a webinar after the in-person event, so that if folks are unable to attend, they can also join in the conversation through the webinar, which will be the following week, I think on the 20th. So we're continuing this engagement process. We will be taking everything we hear and considering all of the input, and then beginning the drafting of the state plan. I didn't cover this in the beginning of the presentation, but states have been given two options, right, as things stand now, to submit their new state education plan. They can submit either in March of 2017 or July of 2017, and we are working toward the March deadline because we want to make sure that the final plan is in place in time for schools to be ready to operationalize, and that we're ready to operationalize the changes. So that's our goal, and you see this slide maps out at a very high level the work that we've mapped out to get to that submission. So what's important to note is that we're working on drafting the actual plan November and December. In January, we will be posting the plan for public comment. So there'll be another opportunity for you all to see, once you see what actually lands in the plan, for you to see and provide comments on the plan. And then during the month of January, we will be hosting community meetings with the State Board of Education in each ward in the city to, again, at a high level, give an overview of the content of the plan. And then February, we'll finalize it, close the comment period, finalize it, and the Board of Education will vote on the plan. And with their approval, we will submit the plan to the Department of Education in early March. So that is where we are. And I wanted to give you one more chance to ask any questions or comments. Just pause for a few minutes here. All right, so we are responding to individual questions, and it looks like we don't have any additional questions at this time. So we will be ending the broadcast. Thank you for your participation today. And again, as we said, we will make sure to send these slides out to you, and also these will be posted on our website. Everything related to the work around ESSA you can find if you, it's osse.dc.gov / ESSA. Thank you. Close but no cigar. So yes, you can, yeah, could you put that in, Anika? So Anika's going to type in the real address. But you can go there. We're keeping that ESSA webpage updated, and so if you, the focus groups I mentioned, all of that information is posted there as well. You can register for those as well. So thank you again for your time, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.